He was the only member of the Beach Boys who could truly swim, a man of the sea, who spent his life chasing the waves, only to drown just a few steps from shore on a cold winter afternoon. Behind the bright stage lights and the songs that captivated millions lay a childhood marked by abuse, friendships that turned to betrayal, love affairs that ended in heartbreak, and a dangerous connection to Charles Manson that he never fully escaped. In his final days, he was often seen wandering alone along the docks, his eyes searching as if trying to recover a piece of his past. People said he was looking for a mysterious box beneath the water. What it contained, no one knows. But just hours later, Dennis Wilson was gone. A strong swimmer, lost in the very waters he knew best, or was someone determined to make sure he stayed silent forever at the bottom of the sea. Chapter 1. A childhood scarred by a father's violent hand. The small flame flickered, its sharp scent of burning match mixing with the musty scent of old wood in the living room. Murray Wilson's hand clamped tightly around his 8-year-old son's wrist, forcing the boy's finger toward the fire. "So you'll remember, never play with fire again." Dennis pulled back, but it was too late. The searing heat spread across his hand, and all he could do was swallow the pain in silence. Moments like that were not rare inside the house at 3701 West 119th Street in Hawthorne. Outside, the sea breeze carried the taste of salt and the distant call of ship horns. But inside, Murray's shouting was louder than anything else. Perhaps that's why Dennis often found ways to avoid the living room, where Brian and Carl practiced under their father's watchful, unforgiving eyes. Instead, he would stand outside the window, his shoulder against the wooden frame, gazing toward the horizon where the golden light of day slowly dissolved into the ocean. But watching wasn't enough. Whenever arguments erupted, Dennis didn't wait to be told to leave. He grabbed his surfboard and crossed the street. The beach greeted him with the rush of wind in his ears, the cold water biting into his skin, and the numbing shiver that ran down his spine as he dove into the waves. When he returned, his hair was always wet, his eyes red, as if he'd swum too far or had been crying. He did it so often that one neighbor swore they once saw him standing motionless in the ocean at midnight, waves curling around his legs, eyes fixed on the distance. No one else could confirm it, and Dennis never explained. But the image, a small boy alone in the dark sea, carried a feeling that was both free and unbearably lonely. At school, Dennis's recklessness earned him the nickname Dennis the Menace. He didn't hesitate to climb onto rooftops, leap into the deep end, or swim all the way to the marker buoy. Perhaps those challenges weren't just for fun, but a way to escape the feeling of being trapped. His mother, Audrey, understood. She often let him run outside as long as he came home for dinner. But even at the dinner table, there was no escaping Murray's lectures about music and perfection. One friend recalled, "That day, after his father yelled at him, Dennis came over to my house. He didn't say a word, just asked to borrow my surfboard. The sky was gray, the waves were high, but he went in anyway, like he wanted the sea to wash everything away." That moment, and the sight of wet hair and red eyes, would follow Dennis for the rest of his life, a silent signal that he'd just returned from the only place he truly felt free. But was that habit of running to the ocean simply an escape? Or had it unknowingly forged a bond that would one day pull him under for the last time? Chapter 2. The Beach Boys became legends, but Dennis did not. For Dennis, school days felt like little more than waiting for the moment he could escape to the ocean. Out there, the waves didn't judge, and the wind set no rules. And when the Beach Boys first began to take shape, the sea once again played its hand in shaping his fate. Brian wanted to form a band with Carl, Mike Love, and Al Jardine. In the original plan, Dennis wasn't included, but their mother, Audrey, spoke a single sentence that changed everything. "You have to let your brother in." Perhaps she knew music would be the only bridge connecting Dennis to his family. Dennis joined the group, though at the time his real talent was surfing, not musicianship. Yet it was Dennis who made the suggestion no one would forget. "Let's sing about surfing." Brian listened, then wrote, "Surfin'." When the song played on the radio, Dennis ran down the street shouting with the joy of a boy who had just rediscovered himself. In those years, America was in the middle of the surf craze. Magazine covers were filled with sun-bleached young men holding surfboards and smiling for the camera. And Dennis, with his wet hair and eyes red from sun and salt, didn't just sing about that life. He was that life. At Capitol Records studio, while Brian and Carl fine-tuned every chord, Dennis would walk in wearing a t-shirt still marked with dried salt stains. He'd sit down, tap out a few beats on the drums, then suddenly get up and step onto the balcony for a cigarette. One sound engineer recalled, he could never sit still for long, like he was always hearing waves somewhere out there. On stage, female fans pushed forward just to be near Dennis. Some even climbed over barriers, bypassing the other band members to hand him a photo or slip him a note. That attention wasn't welcomed by everyone. One acquaintance said Brian avoided standing next to Dennis during shows. He never said it outright, but you could see in his eyes a mix of jealousy and exhaustion. Small cracks in the brothers' relationship began there, quiet but lasting. And in the middle of all that fame, Dennis's habit of disappearing never changed. After a performance or a recording session, while the others went back to the hotel, he might slip away to a nearby beach. Sometimes he swam, sometimes he simply sat and watched the waves. But when he returned, his hair was still wet, his eyes still red. No one asked, and he never explained. Once, the band's manager spotted Dennis at Santa Monica Beach just before dawn. The air was cold, the fog was thick, and he stood barefoot in the wet sand, smoking. When asked what he was doing there, Dennis simply smiled, just looking for a little inspiration. But that inspiration wasn't for music that night. It was for something else, something no one would want to believe had started on nights like these. It was those aimless, late-night wanderings that would lead Dennis to a meeting he would never escape. The question is, during those vanishing nights by the shore, who did Dennis meet first? And from that moment on, was his fate already drifting toward one name, Charles Manson? Chapter 3, From Music to Hollywood Spiral, and the Shadow of Charles Manson. That night, Dennis's hair was still damp from a late swim. His thin shirt clung to his back, carrying the faint salt of the ocean. He drove along the Pacific Coast Highway, the radio blending with the sound of waves rolling in from the dark. On a quiet stretch in Malibu, two young women waved for a ride. Their introductions were brief, their voices tinged with the hazy drawl of someone who had shared a few joints. In the short conversation, they spoke of a teacher, a man they believed could change the world. Dennis just smiled, dropped them off at his house, and headed to the recording studio. When he returned, the lights inside were strangely bright. Out front, an old bus sat parked across his driveway, and on the porch stood a small, wiry man with tangled long hair, eyes both unfamiliar and piercing, Charles Manson. But instead of confrontation, Manson knelt and kissed Dennis's feet, as if performing some strange ritual. Inside, Dennis found more than a dozen people, most of them women, laughing, smoking, and cooking in his kitchen. At first, Dennis saw no reason to object. They cooked for him, cleaned, even shared his bed. Drugs passed from hand to hand. Manson spoke of freedom, of breaking from society's chains, of music as a force that could save the world. Within weeks, Dennis's home had turned into an odd, self-contained community. But nothing came without a price. Manson and his family spent as if Dennis's bank account had no bottom. Clothes, cars, food, even penicillin for sexually transmitted diseases. By the time it was tallied, the cost had reached tens of thousands of dollars, more than half his savings. A friend recalled one morning when Dennis returned from surfing, hair wet, eyes bloodshot, only to find a single bullet resting on his pillow. No note, just what Manson considered a gift. In a private conversation, Dennis admitted he had once witnessed Manson fire an M16 and kill a man. He never went to the police. From that point on, the mood in the house changed. There was still laughter and the smell of food. But Dennis began to feel as if eyes were on him, even in his own bedroom. Perhaps this was the moment he realized He had opened the door to something that would never leave willingly. The question is, when that bullet was placed on his pillow, was it merely a warning? Or a one-way ticket onto the list of victims Manson had already marked? Chapter 4. Signs of a downward spiral. A marriage in ruins. Friends pulling away. One still afternoon, Manson called Dennis out to the porch. On the table lay a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting slanted and smudged along the edges. "Cease to exist," Manson said. A gift, a song meant to heal the rift between Dennis and his bandmates. Dennis read it, nodding. The melody was simple, the lyrics strangely hypnotic. But when he brought it to the studio with the Beach Boys, Dennis changed the words, changed the title to "Never Learn Not to Love." And when the record was pressed, only his name appeared. You can imagine Manson's reaction. To him, this wasn't just the loss of a song, it was betrayal. One band member recalled that from the day the record came out, Dennis became unusually tense. He started showing up late to performances, sometimes disappearing halfway through. Some nights, he would return to the hotel with wet hair and red eyes, claiming he just needed some fresh air. But no one believed it was only the ocean breeze. Then one evening, Dennis received a small package. Inside was the sleeve from the new single, a deep scratch slashing across his name. And in the corner, a flattened bullet. No note. According to a friend, Dennis once confided that he had heard Manson speak in a voice cold as steel. "Anyone who betrays me will pay the price." From then on, he avoided mentioning Manson around strangers, and if someone brought up the name, he would simply shake his head and change the subject. In the studio, Dennis threw himself into his music. His solo album, Pacific Ocean Blue, began to take shape. Songs like River Song and Thoughts of You carried a deep, drifting sadness, the kind you feel on nights alone by the ocean when the waves answer in place of words. Yet even in music, he couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. One sound engineer recalled, "Once, right in the middle of a take, Dennis stopped. He stepped out onto the balcony and stared down at the street for a long time. Then he came back in, pale as a sheet. There was no one down there." The matter of the song was never publicly resolved. Manson never demanded his credit back, but for Dennis, it was an invisible debt, hanging over him like a fishing hook waiting to be pulled. And the question is, was "Cease to Exist" just a song? Or was it a coded message from Manson? One that began unfolding slowly, leading toward an ending beneath the cold water many years later. Chapter 5. The Final Act, and a moment no one can explain. Christmas of 1983. The air in Marina del Rey was cold and damp. Dennis had just left a rehab center in Santa Monica, admitted with a blood alcohol level so high the doctors shook their heads. Friends urged him to stay through the holiday, but Dennis only smiled. "I need the ocean air." He made his way to the docks, where his friend Bill Oster's boat, the Emerald, was moored. That night, Dennis slept on the deck, wearing only a thin jacket, a bottle of vodka within reach. By morning, his hair was wet, his eyes